Hello and welcome to part 7 of this 8-part mini-series about wildlife photography. So in the previous episodes, we've looked at all the pre-trip planning, research, all that kind of thing, knowing your camera, checking your gear, all of that. We've gone through things to do while you're with the animals. So what this episode is about, what this part is about, is how do you now make those images something special. So we're not going to go crazy, but this is post-processing. So why do you want to do that? Well, the first reason, and there are several, is that when you look at an image, it's not quite the way you remember it, particularly if you've left things maybe for a period of time since you took the original shot. So for me, at least, the purpose of post-processing is to kind of restore the image to what I remember wanting to photograph at the time. So it's putting details back in, maybe highlights that haven't come out so well in the initial shot, that kind of thing. And why do they not come out in the shot? Well, the fact is, with a lot of wildlife photography, you have to be very fast. So a big theme in this series has been being prepared, being ready at any moment to grab that shot because you don't know when it's going to happen. But when you do that, things might be wrong. Now, it might be as minor as a horizon not being quite level, or you might need to completely recrop it because you've really snatched at a shot. You've got the bit you needed, you've got the animal, but everything else is a little bit wrong. So really the purpose of post-processing, in my opinion, is to create an image that supports the subject, presents the subject in a way that is appealing to you, otherwise why did you take it, and hopefully appealing to other people. It's not about going crazy with saturation and things like that. It's not about taking things out, putting things in. Basically, it's about trying to create a true version of the image that you took. So, and by true, I mean as close to actual life as you can. Now, something I have been asked about quite often is how ethical is it to post-process an image? Now, this, in my experience, tends to come from people who are a bit older, who grew up with film. And back in those days, we really didn't do much post-processing. Some people would work a little bit with colors, but that was pretty specialist. The black and white was probably easier to work with, and I knew people who did their own developing and they could work on an image to bring out certain parts. But on the whole, once you press the shutter button, for a lot of people, that was it. So having access to post-processing obviously opens the door to start manipulating an image in a way that it deceives. In other words, it basically shows something that never actually happened. So my answer to that, if that's one of your questions, is simply to ask, what is your intent? If your intent is to deceive, to manipulate, to do any of that kind of stuff, then I don't really want you listening to the podcast because I don't like working with those people. If, however, your intent is to just try and correct things that are wrong in the shot, and there are all sorts of reasons why that can happen, and essentially to present a final image that is as close to what you saw as you can, then to me that's fine. There's no problem with that whatsoever. And in fact, I think as a general guide, if you're really not sure, then have a look at any photography competition. Most, certainly the ones I've looked at, so I can't say it's every competition, but certainly the ones I've looked at, they have very strict rules about what you can do in post-processing. And I would use those rules as a guideline, and it's essentially reflected, probably in a more concise way, what I've just said. So, having said all of that, you've got your images, you've come back from your trip perhaps, or your shoot. Now, one thing I will say, one of the traps we can fall into as photographers is when we take a shot, we generally have something in mind and we can be very critical. And there's various reasons why we might do that, and I'm not going to go into those, but we can be quite critical about the shot that we're looking at. The main reason for that is that when we took the shot, we perhaps had a particular result in mind, and then what we're looking at in the back of the camera is not that result, it's something different. So there's a temptation to just delete the image, and I would strongly advise against that, and very simply because if you just leave it there and then leave it for a few months, then look at the image again, what's happening there is you've probably forgotten the original image that you had in mind when you took the shot. So what you're doing is you're now looking at that image as an image in its own right. You're not comparing it to what you had in your mind because you've forgotten what that was. In that way, you can be a lot more objective. And I've certainly found that several times with some, in fact, some of my favorite images are images that initially I was not happy with. And because I was hoping to get a different result. So that image wasn't what I was hoping for. I didn't delete them. I looked back at them sometime later, and then I started looking at them as an image in their own right. I could see potential in them, a bit of post-processing that we'll talk about now, and then off we go. So very first thing, all the way through this, I have been saying shoot raw. So the reason for saying that is that RAW captures all of the data that you can from your camera. So it has a lot of details of the image itself. There's also metadata and other things which can be useful. For example, if you're using Photoshop, there is a lens correction setting. And what that does, Photoshop has a database of various manufacturers' lenses. And once you've program them in, or if it, in fact, I don't think you even program them in anymore, it can recognize the lens from the metadata, and it can select a profile from its database which will correct any known distortions that that lens puts in. So that little things like this can be quite useful. Of course, you've got your shutter speed, date it was taken, all that kind of thing, which is also very helpful. So the key thing, though, is that you've got a lot of information about that image, and this gives you the best possibility of producing a corrected image that hopefully meets your expectations. So, and I will just say, sorry, before I dive into that, is that JPEG, if you're not familiar, because generally that's an option on cameras to save in JPEG, JPEG compresses data, and the reason it does that is to create a much smaller file, which is great for downloading on from websites, putting on Facebook, Instagram, that kind of thing. So by all means, save the final version of the image as a JPEG, but start with a RAW always and go from there. So the kind of things to do, basic adjustments you can do are exposure, first of all, so you can correct any underexposure or overexposed areas without losing detail. And you can use the histogram. So the histogram, I'm going to refer a little bit at Photoshop because that's what I'm most familiar with. The histogram will show you a nice even spread from the darkest part of the image to the lightest part of the image. I think it's that way around, left to right. And you don't want any strong peaks anywhere. You can also adjust the white balance, so you can adjust the lighting to be natural looking light. So sometimes, though, you can what we call warm it up, so make an image a little more kind of orangey, more like you would get in golden hour actually, or you can cool it down a bit, so basically push it towards the blue. And why might you want to do those? You might want to do that to just work on the mood a little bit. Now, speaking personally, it's very, very rare for me to change the white balance. I generally don't do that. And in fact, for pretty much all of my shots, I would rarely spend more than 2 minutes in Photoshop on them. So that gives you an idea. It's just, that's what I do. I'm not saying that's what you should be doing, but I like to minimize it. And as I say, what I'm looking for is to try and recreate that original image as I remember it. So other settings are contrast and clarity. So with contrast, you're really looking at the dynamic range, I suppose, is another way of describing that, the difference between the darkest parts and the lightest parts. And if you get the contrast right, from my perspective, what I'm looking for there is the image starts to feel three-dimensional. I can just see more depth. I can see more tones. I can see more detail in the animal's musculature, for example. So there's more shapes in there. And if you're careful with the contrast, you can just get work with shadow and highlights to get a really nice contrast, so that animal, in my mind, it kind of pops is the phrase I use, but that's what I use that for. And clarity is another thing which can just sharpen things a little bit. So I can't give you an example here because this is audio, but do experiment a little bit, but always don't go crazy with this stuff, regardless of which editor you're using. You can try defaults. Sometimes I'll just pop the default raw editor setting on just to see what it gives me, and normally I'll take out the highlights and the light settings, drop those to 0, and then work in curve is what I do, and then just work on the contrast, work on the different elements until I feel that it's where I want it to be. And this probably sounds a bit vague, but it's simply because it's through experience, and it's also, I think, very subjective at this point. So it's what feels right to you, what feels right for me, might not feel right for somebody else. The next thing to do is look at enhancing details and sharpness. So you've got the sharpening tool. Now, I don't tend to use these things very much, but if you do want to really work on an image, then you do have tools that allow you to select things like the eyes, fur, feathers, or key parts of the image, and just sharpen them. And bearing in mind that particularly if you're doing portraits, the eyes are going to be the most important part of the animal. That might be something worth looking at. Do avoid over sharpening because you start getting a kind of halo effect. So anything that looks odd, you really want to avoid that. Unless you're deliberately going for an abstract feel, that's it's whatever floats your boat, basically. But if you're looking for something that's real, which is what I'm interested in, then be very careful about over-processing images because it does start to show up. Noise reduction is a good one, particularly if you've got a lot of either smooth sky or backgrounds that have a lot of one color in them. So things like noise from perhaps you had to shoot in a higher ISO, they become a lot more obvious where you've got a block of single color. So use what you can to reduce that. And think about cropping as well. Think about how you're putting your final image look together. What's the composition? So you might have used rule of thirds, which is fine. But then you might decide it's not working. And in fact, something I tend to do, because sometimes when I've worked on a few images, I start to get a little bit punch drunk with it, to be honest. So I suddenly can't quite get it where I want it, and I'm not even sure what I want. So what I'll tend to do, if I need to get something finished, just what I will do is just change the orientation of the shot, as in I'll switch from a landscape format to portrait, and that makes me, it's kind of like looking at the image again. But if it was originally shot in landscape, which is what most of mine are, if I flip it to portrait, then I'm just looking at a more detailed area of that particular image, and I start to see different things there, and that gives me more ideas. So if you are getting stuck, sort of writer's block with the post-processing, think about doing that. Just do something different. On the color side of it, you have on Photoshop vibrance and saturation. So saturation, vibrance tends to work with more specific colors. So I tend to use vibrance if I want to bring out sky, the blue in the sky, things like that. Again, with different images, I tend to work with the balance of the two. Again, I might slightly oversaturate from time to time, but I don't do it very often. And in fact, the guideline that I use when I'm setting the color is quite often there will be grass or leaves in the shot because I'm shooting wildlife, so I'm out in nature. And I just try and get that green to look as realistic as I can. And as it happens, I can look out of my window here and see a hedge and some grass. So that gives me a visual reference, and it just gives me a way of keeping things together. So I might have that kind of little bit of punch I want in the image, but I've not gone crazy with totally oversaturated images. Now, I do see a lot of saturated images about, and again, look, it's subjective. It's whatever works for you. The thing I would say when you're working with all of this is to think about mood. And I've spoken before in the portrait episode about when you're shooting, using depth of field to maybe get in tight on an animal, but kind of either blur out the background or even make it sort of almost disappear. So this is something you can really work on in post-processing. And also you can just change elements. So if you've, for example, got leading lines in there, anything like that, you can just change the composition a little bit so they start maybe in one corner of the frame. So there's a lot you can do. As I say, I tend to minimize it because my interest really is in creating something that's as realistic as I can get it. And to be perfectly honest, in a nutshell, that is most of what I would do in Photoshop. Now, there are other packages around. Topaz Labs, that I might have got the name wrong in an earlier episode, but Topaz Labs produced specialized software designed to sharpen images, get rid of blur, to get rid of pixelations, to get rid of noise, and also to make an image much bigger. So I spoke about gigapixels in another episode. And what that does when you use gigapixel, what it does, it increases the size of the image, because and where I would use this is if I'm trying to produce an image that I can maybe print out at A1 or A0 size. And even though the negs I start with are as big as I can get, so I've got a lot of data to work with, to get something that big, I like to have a little bit of extra size to the image. So what Gigapixel AI does, as it's moving the pixels apart, which is essentially what digital zoom does, it's filling in using quite a sophisticated algorithm what these new pixels should look like in order to match the rest. And I've been quite happy with the results so far. They do another one, I think it's Photo AI. I haven't tried that. I believe it's a combination of the other three packages, but I can't really comment on that. They also do have a version that is JPEG to RAW. I haven't tried that. Based on what I've seen from Topaz Labs, their stuff is quite good. So really, I guess almost to round up, because I don't have a huge amount to say on post-processing. Why do you want to post-process? Well, the first thing is to correct just basic errors. It might be in framing, or you might think of a better framing once you've got the shot, or you might want to change the orientation altogether. The next thing is to get things like the color right and the contrast so that the image pops a little bit. It's attractive, it draws the viewer in, it brings the viewer in. And one of the definition I like, I heard this some time ago, and I definitely have mentioned it before in other podcasts, but my favorite definition of what makes a good photograph, because what does make a good photograph, is simply that the longer somebody looks at it, the better the image. In other words, the more time they spend not trying to work out what it is, I don't mean that, but just looking at it, just being drawn in, maybe drawn to the eye of an animal, but maybe there are other things in the composition that support it, gives some indication of where it lives, its environment, maybe what its challenges are. The longer you have somebody looking at that, the more successful the image, because it's something they're likely to remember as well, because you've engaged them. Whereas there are a lot of images that are very flat, very uninteresting. They haven't really made good use of the subject, and it's the kind of image you'll just flick past without a second look. So that's not where you want to be. So do that. Think about composition. You might even go black and white, because once you take the color out, you're then looking at shapes and textures, and that can be quite different. In the last episode, I believe I spoke about this. And certainly with things like elephants. So I produced a book, which was Elephants in Black and White. First of all, you can really get a feel for the texture in their skin, but also on the headshots, portraits, you can see a lot of the hairs that are on the face, which you don't normally see, and around the lips. So this is something I like about black and white, because it's not how we see things. When we do look at something in black and white, we see it differently. We perhaps see more there than we would when it's in colour, which is how we normally see things. As I've said, the key thing, in my opinion, is to enhance what you've shot in such a way that it feels it's more accurate, it's closer to what you actually experienced, and it allows the viewer to feel a connection with it. And if you don't know what I mean by that, just think about wildlife photographs that you really liked, that maybe you've got on your wall or somewhere. Go and have another look at them, but do it through the eye of the photographer, and look at the steps that photographer took in getting that image. So what I mean by that is things like composition, lighting, have a stab at what they may have done in post-processing. What have they done with the colour? Have they oversaturated? Have they kept it fairly neutral? Have they gone black and white? How have they used light? How have they used shadow? How have they used contrast? Do you get a feeling that you could almost reach out and touch that animal? So these are the kind of things to think about. So next steps, what I suggest you do is go back over particularly older shots and have a look at them again, but with new eyes, and just have a look at them in post-processing, see what you can do with them, because you may well find you've suddenly got an image that you absolutely love that you'd overlooked before. And a good idea is to put them together in a portfolio. That could be something that you might want to use in some sort of professional way. It may just be for your own pleasure, or it might be for another way of sharing your images, which is what I'm going to talk about next time. So I'm going to leave that there. I hope it's given you some clues about post-processing. I've deliberately not been very specific, primarily because things like Photoshop, Lightroom, all of that they tend to change their user interfaces quite often, or normally when I'm just getting used to them, they change them. So I don't want to get too specific on the post-processing, but I do want to set down some guidelines, I suppose, about where I feel post-processing sits in creating the final image. And of course, that final image, once you finish your post-processing, that's stage 4. So stage 1 is planning the shoot, planning the image. Stage 2 is acquiring it. Stage 3 is post-processing. Stage 4 is where it becomes art, because that's where other people look at it, and they're looking at that image through the lens of their own life experience. So what they see in that image may well be something different to what you're seeing when you put it together. So that's it for this part, and I'll speak to you in the final part of this mini-series. So speak to you then. Bye for now. Oh, and just one more thing before you go. Just remember to drop any comments that you have or questions, and I'll get back to them in a future podcast. And remember that there's a new podcast every Friday. So if you've enjoyed this one, please remember to like and subscribe, and join me on my mailing list, and you'll get a heads up about the latest podcast. So bye for now.